Welcome back, class. Mr. Rasmussen here. As you can see above me, what we're going to be talking about in this lesson is bone cells and bone growth. This is lesson 10C. One of the things that absolutely amazes me as a biology teacher is the changes that an organism has to go through in order to become an adult. If you think about this in the context of this baby elephant, think about all the things that have to happen in this baby elephant's body in order to become this adult elephant. Especially with bones. Their bones are going to have to grow immensely in strength and size and structure. Just an incredible change that has to take place, even if we're just talking about the skeletal system. If you were a lobster, for instance, something with an exoskeleton, your life would be a little different. You would grow until you outgrew your skeleton, and then you would throw it away, and you would just grow a new one. Well, us, for organisms who have endoskeletons, we don't have that luxury. We don't get to throw away our skeleton when it gets too small. We don't reach inside of us, rip out our skeleton and toss it away, and then just plug a new one in there every time we want to grow. Our bones have to grow with us and develop with us, so that's a process we're going to talk about here. In order to really have a good understanding of this, we need to know a lot about bone cells, so we're going to first talk about bone cells. The first type of cell we're going to look at is what's called an osteoprogenitor cell. And a progenitor cell is a stem cell. These are cells that are undifferentiated. They're not actually the cells they're going to become, but what their job is to create other cells. So how this works is we have a progenitor cell, and I'll put a P in it so we know it's the progenitor cell. And that progenitor cell is going to divide. It's going to do mitosis, and when it does that, it's going to create two new cells. It's these new cells that are going to have jobs. They're going to have functions, or they're what we call a differentiated cell. So these are the differentiated cells, but they came from a progenitor cell. Bones work the same way. They have osteoprogenitor cells. And what they're going to do is they're going to divide and create these things called osteoblasts. So here's our osteoblast progenitor cell. Here's our progenitor cell. And as it divides, oh, by the way, they call it a precursor. We're going to call it a progenitor. So what happens is, as it divides, it's going to mature into an osteoblast. So it eventually divides and becomes an osteoblast. So that's the first one, an osteoprogenitor cell. The next one are these osteoblasts. And osteoblasts are cells that are actually going to secrete the bone matrix. They're actually going to create bone. So they generate bone for us. So right down here, if we take a look at this picture, here's our osteoblasts in the bottom. I'll underline them here. And they're found in this line. This line is that tissue layer called the endosteum. The endosteum. So these osteoblasts here are going to create bone. They're going to create the compact bone and the spongy bone on either sides of them. So as they create bone, they're actually going to become surrounded in bone. And when they become surrounded in bone, they can no longer secrete bone, so they have to mature further, and they mature into mature bone cells called osteocytes. So they are mature bone cells, and they're surrounded by bone. So here's our osteocyte in here, and it's in that little hole in the bone, right? Remember those holes? And out here is the mature bone matrix. Out here's the mature bone matrix. So that's an osteocyte. So kind of an amazing journey. We start off with a progenitor cell. The progenitor cell, when we need osteoblasts, the progenitor cell is going to divide and create osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts are going to secrete bone until they become mature, or until they become surrounded, and then they're going to mature into osteocytes. And the osteocytes are just going to help maintain this matrix, help keep it up. Well, there's one more key player we need to talk about, and that's an osteoclast. An osteoclast it does the opposite of what an osteoblast does. And it's kind of weird to think that this happens in your bone, but it's going to remove calcium salts, and it's actually going to break down bone. So osteoclasts, these big cells out here, if we can, we see our osteoblasts down here in our endosteum. But these osteoclasts, their job is to dissolve bone, to break it down, to dissolve it, to get rid of it, to break down bone. And it's these two cells working together, the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts, that are going to make sure that our bone is the correct thickness, that it's the correct length, that it fits our body perfectly. So if we need more bone, we'll generate more bone. If we need less bone, we'll break down the bone we have. Now, if this balance gets off, that could cause problems. If our osteoclasts are working too much, that can make our bones brittle, small, or have other problems. If our osteoblasts work too much, we could have problems in which we generate too much bone, and then we end up with large bone problems. So it's these cells all working together that develop and grow bone as our body grows. Let's talk real quick about what happens when we're an infant. So when we start out as an infant, most of our bones are not developed at all. They're what we call cartilage models. So they're not the bone that's actually it's going to become. They're just models of the bone. So let's take a look at this. So if we look at bone growth, we also give that the term ossification, or the creating of bone. When we're an infant, this is how it works. We start off with what's called a cartilage model. It's not a bone, it's just a cartilage shape that sort of looks like what the bone is going to become. So we start off with, when we're born or when we're developing in the womb, we have these cartilage models. And what happens is, these cartilage models, they develop what's called a primary ossification center. And it first develops in the middle of the bone. Okay? We also develop this bone collar around the outside, but we develop this ossification center. And this ossification center then becomes infused with blood vessels. So blood vessels go into these ossification centers, and it's at these places where the osteoblasts start making new bone. And in here, the osteoblasts are working, and they're turning this cartilage into bone. They're creating the bone in here. Then up here, we develop these secondary ossification centers out here in the ends of the bone. So out here, we get more blood vessels that infuse in, and the osteoblasts out here start creating bone. So as this progresses, we have a primary ossification center, which eventually becomes the medullary cavity. And then we get these secondary ossification centers up here, which will eventually become the spongy bone. Right? And then out here, when it's all completed, we have this compact bone here, spongy bone and medullary cavity, and then we have the spongy bone on the outside. Some of that cartilage is actually left on the outside, and it becomes our articular cartilage. So that's how bones grow and develop. They start off as this bone collar, and then we get these ossification centers that become infused with blood, and then they start growing and ossifying and becoming bone. It's those osteoblasts that do that. And as that develops, we get secondary ossification centers, and they also develop there. So it's from those 3 points that we develop bone, from these cartilage models as infants. So that's how our bone grows. Those are the cells that are involved. If you have any questions, class, feel free to ask me anytime. Love to help you make sense of this stuff. So good luck to you, class. We'll talk to you later.